Dawn broke scrubland, turning the frost to glass. Will Carter walked his fence line the way he always did, slow, listening, until the farm itself seemed to flinch. The horses shifted and snorted in their stalls. The chickens stayed silent. Even the wind felt wrong, as if it had decided not to move. Out in the open field he saw them. Coyotes, 5, maybe 6, spaced with eerie precision, forming a perfect circle. They didn't skulk or snap. They stood still, heads low, eyes bright, watching the center. A woman knelt in the brittle grass, shoulders trembling. Her hair clung to her face with dew and tears. She wasn't being torn apart. She wasn't being chased. She looked like someone who had arrived at a place she'd been avoiding for years and finally stopped running. Before the story begins, if you want us to keep bringing dramatic, emotional stories like this, please help by subscribing to the channel. We are pushing toward the first 1,000 subscribers YouTube requires, and your support makes these videos possible. Will Carter had lived on this patch of land long enough to trust small changes. A gate that swung too easy. A crow call that cut off mid-note. The way the air tasted when weather turned. This morning the air tasted like pennies and cold stone. He moved along the fence with his gloves half on, coffee still warming his palm in a metal mug. The eastern sky was pale, and the grass carried a crust of frost that cracked under his boots. His old cattle dog, Ruger, stayed unusually close, tail held low, not tucked, but uncertain. Will paused near the water trough. The surface had a skin of ice, unbroken. No hoofprints, no scatter of birds. Nothing had come to drink in the night. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing waited beyond the last stretch of mesquite, out where the pasture flattened into open ground. Coyotes. Not one or two, which wouldn't have surprised him. Coyotes were part of the landscape the way tumbleweeds and dry creek beds were. In the last few decades, they'd learned to live near people with unsettling ease, slipping through gaps in fences, crossing roads at the darkest hour, raising pups in places humans swore were too busy or too loud. But this wasn't a quick sighting. This wasn't a shadow darting away. They stood arranged like markers on a map, evenly spaced, each one facing inward. Will's stomach tightened. He'd seen coyotes scatter when approached, and he'd seen them hold their ground when defending a den. He'd even heard their nighttime chorus, those yips and rising howls that sounded like a crowd when it might only be a family group. Still, he'd never seen them do this. Silent, motionless, deliberate. At the center of their ring was a woman on her knees. Her hands were bare. Her fingers looked numb, reddened at the knuckles. She wore a light jacket that wasn't enough for the cold, and her jeans were stained dark at the knees from damp grass. Her shoulders shook in short, quiet pulses that didn't carry sound. Like she'd been crying for so long, she no longer had the energy to make noise. Will didn't rush. He'd learned that sudden movement around wildlife turned curiosity into panic, and panic into teeth. He set his coffee mug on a fence post and lifted one hand, palm open, as if the coyotes could read it. Ruger gave a low sound in his throat, not a bark, more like a warning he wasn't sure he should voice. "Easy," Will murmured, more to his dog than anything else. The coyotes didn't lunge, they didn't snarl. Their mouths were closed. Their ears tracked him in tiny adjustments. A coyote's face could look like a grin even when it wasn't. Long muzzle, sharp cheekbones, that alert, bright-eyed expression. Will knew better than to read human emotion into it. He watched their bodies instead. Tails low, weight balanced, no bristling fur. Not hunting, not cornered, guarding. He took a few steps closer, careful with his footing so the frost wouldn't betray him with a loud crack. The ring held. One coyote blinked slowly. Another shifted a paw and set it down again almost in the same spot, as if any change might break whatever rule they were following. Will's mouth went dry. He'd heard plenty of talk over the years, people blaming coyotes for every missing cat, every strange noise, every uneasy feeling after dark. But coyotes were opportunists, not monsters. Most of the time they avoided confrontation with humans because humans were loud and unpredictable and carried the kind of danger that struck from far away. Yet here they were, in full view, at dawn. Will forced himself to breathe through his nose. He looked at the woman again. Her hair was tangled and damp, and her lips were cracked. She kept her gaze lowered as if she couldn't bear to look at the animals around her, or at herself. "Ma'am," Will called, voice steady but not loud. "Can you hear me?" Her head lifted a fraction. Her eyes were open, glassy with exhaustion, fixed somewhere past him. She didn't answer at first. Her throat worked like swallowing hurt. One of the coyotes, closest to Will, stepped forward. Just one pace. It wasn't a charge. It was a warning, clean and controlled like a gate swinging shut. Will stopped instantly. The coyote stopped too, holding him with a stare that felt far too focused for a wild animal. Territorial behavior, he told himself, or protective. Coyotes lived in tight family units. The pair that bred in spring often led a group of helpers, older pups and relatives that defended the area. They communicated with posture and distance as much as sound, how close you were allowed to come, how quickly you were expected to retreat. And right now, the boundary line was drawn in frost. Will raised his other hand as well, palms out, shoulders relaxed. He took one slow step back to prove he understood. The coyote stepped back too, resetting the circle, not random, not fear, a rule. Will's pulse beat behind his ears. He tried again, softer. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" The woman's mouth trembled. When she finally spoke, her voice came out thin, scraped raw by the cold. "I can't," she whispered. The words barely carried, but the meaning landed hard. She wasn't saying she couldn't speak. She was saying she couldn't move, or couldn't leave. Will scanned the ground between her and the coyotes, searching for what he might have missed. A trap, a snare line, something that explained why she'd stayed kneeling through an entire night. But the grass was short and stiff with frost, empty except for tracks. There were tracks everywhere, small neat paw prints that circled and circled, layered over themselves like a pattern someone had drawn on purpose. No blood, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, just a vigil. Will's mind reached for the simplest explanation. She'd stumbled into a den site, and the coyotes were holding her until she backed off. But it wasn't the season for pups yet. Early spring was when dens mattered most. And this ring wasn't a barrier to keep her away. It was a barrier to keep her in. Ruga whined, a thin sound that made one coyote's ears flick toward the dog. Will put 2 fingers to Ruga's collar and held him steady. Stay. He shifted his weight and tried to think like a rancher, not a panicked man watching a nightmare unfold. If he ran for his rifle, things could turn ugly fast. Coyotes were quick, and fear could flip their restraint into chaos. If he rushed the circle, he could trigger exactly what he wanted to prevent. But if he did nothing, the woman might collapse in the cold. Will took off his own jacket, the heavier one, and held it out at arm's length like an offering. He advanced only half a step and lowered the jacket onto the grass, not toward the coyotes, but toward the woman, close enough she could reach it if she dared. The coyotes watched, one's nose lifted, sampling the air. Another blinked, slow as a metronome. The woman's gaze dropped to the jacket. For a moment her expression tightened with something like shame. Then her hand moved, stiffly, as if her joints had turned to rust, and she dragged the jacket toward her lap. She wrapped it around her shoulders with a clumsy tug. A tiny mercy accepted. Will's throat burned. "What's your name?" he asked. Her lips parted. She swallowed again, eyes shining. "My name is Sarah Miller," she said, and the coyotes held their circle like they recognized the sound. Will felt the hair lift on his arms. He didn't know why that detail mattered, only that it did. Sarah's gaze finally met his, and in it he saw something worse than fear. Certainty. The kind that came from understanding exactly what a person was being made to face. "I've been here all night," she whispered. "They wouldn't let me go." And as the sun climbed another inch, one of the coyotes took that single measured step forward again, reminding Will that whatever this was, it wasn't over. Will Carter took a breath that burned his lungs, the cold air settling deep in his chest. His hand hovered near the knife on his belt, but he didn't draw it. Drawing a weapon changed the energy of an encounter. It turned a negotiation into a fight, and Will knew enough about coyotes to know they were masters of escalation. He took another step. The frost crunched loudly, a gunshot sound in the quiet morning. The circle rippled. It wasn't a chaotic scramble. It was a fluid, unified motion, like water displacing around a stone. As Will stepped forward, the two coyotes directly in his path drifted sideways, maintaining their distance but refusing to break the line. They were small, wiry things, maybe 30 pounds soaking wet, but their winter coats made them look formidable, grey and tawny fur bristling along their spines. Will knew that coyotes were smarter than most people gave them credit for. They weren't just scavengers, they were problem solvers. Studies he'd read in old agricultural journals claimed they could learn the shift changes of security guards or memorize the schedule of garbage trucks. They adapted, they watched, and right now they were watching him with an intelligence that felt almost human. "Sarah," Will said, his voice low and firm, "I'm going to walk to you. Do not stand up quickly." Sarah didn't move. She was trembling so violently that her teeth clicked together, a erratic rhythm against the silence. "They won't let you," she stammered. "Watch me," Will said, though he didn't feel half as confident as he sounded. He locked eyes with the largest coyote, a male with a notch missing from his left ear. The animal's gaze was amber and unblinking. In the wild, direct eye contact was a challenge, a threat. But Will needed to establish that he wasn't prey. He projected calm authority, the same way he handled a spooked stallion. He stepped into the gap. The notched ear male lowered his head and let out a sound that wasn't a growl, but a huff of air, a warning. The muscles in the animal's hindquarters bunched. Will knew coyotes could hit speeds of 40 miles per hour in a sprint. If they decided to rush him, he'd be on the ground before he could shout. But they didn't rush. They shifted. The circle expanded. It didn't break. It just grew larger to include him. Will felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. They weren't afraid of him. They were simply making room. He reached Sarah and dropped to one knee beside her. Up close, the situation was worse than it looked from the fence. Her skin was the color of old parchment, pale and waxy. Her lips were blue. The smell of damp earth and stale fear clung to her clothes. She had clearly been kneeling here for hours, her jeans soaked through from the ground. "We need to get you warm," Will said, reaching for her arm. Her sleeve was stiff with cold. "I tried," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a coyote with a pale chest marking. "I tried to leave, when the moon was high. I stood up." "What happened?" Will asked, rubbing her back vigorously to generate friction, heat, anything. "They stood up," she said. "Every time I moved my foot toward the edge, there they snapped, not at me, just at the air, snap, snap." She mimicked the sound, a hollow click. But when I knelt back down, silence. Will looked around the ring. The animals sat on their haunches now, tails wrapped around their paws to conserve heat. It was a behavior he'd seen 100 times through binoculars, usually from hundreds of yards away. Coyotes were family-oriented creatures, often mating for life, with both parents raising the young. They were social, communicative, and fiercely protective of their own. But this behavior, trapping a human without touching her, was unheard of. It defied every instinct of self-preservation they possessed. Usually, a human presence meant instant flight. "Can you stand?" Will asked. "I don't know," Sarah murmured. "Lean on me. We're walking out. Same way I came in." He pulled her up. She was dead weight, her legs numb and useless. She groaned as blood rushed back into cramped limbs. As soon as she reached her full height, the dynamic in the field changed instantly. The coyotes stood up in unison, ears pinned back, lips curled just enough to show the white flash of canines. A low, vibrating hum started in the throat of the notched ear male, and it was picked up by the others. A surround sound frequency that rattled in Will's bones. "Easy," Will warned them, his voice hardening. "Back off." He tightened his grip on Sarah's waist and took a step toward the farmhouse. The coyotes stepped with them. They didn't attack, but they didn't retreat. They formed an escort, a moving prison wall. They kept pace, matching Will's stride perfectly. If he sped up, they trotted. If he slowed, they paused. It was a display of coordination that made Will's skin crawl. It felt like being herded. "Don't look at them," Will instructed Sarah, feeling her sag against him. Just look at the porch light. Keep your eyes on the house. They moved through the frost-bitten grass, a slow, painful procession. Every few yards a coyote would yip, a sharp, high-pitched sound that could travel for miles. It was how they located pack members or signaled territory. But here, close up, it sounded like a signal. They are moving. We are watching. By the time they reached the gravel driveway, Will was sweating despite the freezing air. His muscles were coiled tight, waiting for the snap of jaws that never came. As his boot hit the gravel, the coyotes stopped. It was as if an invisible electric fence ran along the driveway's edge. The pack halted in a jagged line, sitting down one by one. They watched Will drag Sarah toward the warmth of the house, their amber eyes catching the first true rays of the sun. Will didn't stop until he had Sarah inside, seated on the old armchair by the wood stove. He grabbed a wool blanket and wrapped her tight, his hands shaking as the adrenaline finally began to dump out of his system. He went to the window and looked out. They were still there, statues in the morning light. He turned back to Sarah. She was staring at the fire, the orange glow reflecting in eyes that looked too old for her face. "They didn't touch you," Will said, more a statement than a question. "All night. They could have, but they didn't." Sarah pulled the blanket tighter, shivering as the heat began to penetrate her frozen skin. She looked up at Will, and the expression on her face wasn't relief. It was a heavy, crushing acceptance. "They weren't hunting, Will," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Then what were they doing?" She looked toward the window, toward the line of watchers waiting in the cold. "They were charging me," she said softly, "like a debt collector." Will frowned. "Collecting what?" Sarah closed her eyes and a single tear tracked through the dirt on her cheek. "My past." The farmhouse kitchen was warm, smelling of old coffee and wood smoke, but Sarah Miller sat shivering as if the frost was still in her bones. Will had wrapped her in 2 wool blankets and set a steaming mug in front of her, but she hadn't touched it. Her eyes kept darting to the window, where the pale morning light revealed the silhouette of the ridge. They were still out there. Will didn't need to look to know. "You said they were charging you," Will said, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Like a debt." Sarah flinched. She looked down at her hands, the knuckles red and raw. "Do you know how coyotes teach their young to avoid traps?" Will frowned. "They learn from watching the adults, or from getting caught and getting lucky." "No," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "They learn because they remember. They remember patterns, scents, mistakes." She looked up, and her eyes were dark pools of guilt. "I taught them." Will pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. "Start from the beginning." Sarah took a shaky breath. 5 years ago. I was fresh out of college, desperate for work. A private contractor hired me for a predator control program. It wasn't strictly on the books. Ranchers in the area were losing livestock, and they wanted the problem gone, fast, quiet. Will's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Eradication programs were brutal, often indiscriminate. They didn't just target problem animals, they targeted everything that moved. "My job wasn't to shoot," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "I was the spotter. I mapped the dens. I tracked their movements. Coyotes are incredibly adaptable. If you pressure them in one area, they move to another, or they have larger litters to compensate. It's a biological response called compensatory reproduction. Kill half the pack, and the survivors breed younger, have more pups, and the population bounces back stronger." Will nodded slowly. He'd read about that. Nature fighting back with sheer numbers. "We knew that," Sarah whispered. "So the goal wasn't just to cull, it was to wipe them out completely. Denning season. We'd find the mothers, the pups." A log shifted in the wood stove, a sharp crack that made Sarah jump. "One night," she said, her voice dropping to a hush, "we tracked a large pack to a canyon about 10 miles from here. It was efficient. Too efficient. We used calls, distress cries of a wounded rabbit, to lure them in. But then we used something else. Recorded howls of a rival pack invading their territory." She paused, staring into the mug of coffee, as if seeing the scene play out in the dark liquid. "They came to defend their home," she said, tears spilling over. The alpha pair. The beta males, the yearlings, they all came, and the team. They didn't miss. Will stayed silent, the weight of her confession filling the room. He could picture it. The confusion, the noise, the sudden, violent end to a family unit that had likely held that territory for generations. "But we missed one," Sarah said. She looked up, eyes wide and haunted. A pup, maybe 4 months old. He was hiding in the brush, watching. I saw him. Our eyes met. He had this distinct notch in his left ear, a tear from a fight or a fence. Will felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. The notched ear. "He didn't run," Sarah said. "He just watched. He watched us load the bodies. He watched us laugh. He watched me mark the kill on my map." "And you let him go?" Will asked. "I froze," she admitted. "I couldn't call it in. I just left him there, alone." She took a sip of the coffee, her hands shaking so bad the liquid sloshed over the rim. "After that night, I quit. So I couldn't do it anymore. But it didn't matter. I started seeing them everywhere, at the grocery store parking lot, standing at the edge of the lights, in my backyard, on my morning jog, always watching, never attacking, just present." "They were tracking you," Will realized. "Coyotes have territories that can range up to 40 square miles, but transients, ones looking for a home, can travel hundreds. That pup, he traveled." "He grew up," Sarah said, "and he didn't forget. He found a new pack, or maybe he built one, but he remembered the scent. He remembered the face." She looked at the window again. "Last night my car broke down on the old service road. I knew it wasn't an accident. I felt it before it happened. When I got out, they were already there, waiting." "They didn't attack you," Will reminded her. "If they wanted revenge, you'd be dead." "That's the thing," Sarah said, a strange, tragic smile touching her lips. "Death is quick. In the wild, death is mercy. What they did last night, surrounding me, holding me there in the cold, forcing me to feel helpless, exposed, terrified." She leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "They wanted me to know what it felt like to be the one in the center." Will stood up and walked to the window. He peered through the blinds. The sun was fully up now, but the coyotes hadn't dispersed. They were still there, a silent line on the ridge, watching the house. And in the center of the line sat the large male with the notched ear. He wasn't looking at the house in general. He was looking right at the window. "They aren't done," Will said quietly. "No," Sarah said. "They're waiting for the rest of the payment." The sun climbed higher, but the cold didn't break. Will paced the kitchen, checking the window every few minutes. The coyotes hadn't moved. They were patient, statues carved from the tawny landscape. It was unnatural behavior for animals that usually melted away at the first sign of human activity. Sarah had stopped shivering, but a different kind of tension had taken hold of her. She stood abruptly, the wool blanket pooling at her feet. "I have to go back out there," she said. Will spun around. "Are you crazy? You just told me they hunted you down." "Not hunted," she corrected, her voice gaining strength. "Herded. They brought me here. To your land, to this spot." She walked to the window and placed a hand on the glass. "They're not waiting for me to run, Will. They're waiting for me to acknowledge it." "Acknowledge what? That you did your job 5 years ago?" Will argued, though he felt the hollowness of his own words. "They're wild animals, Sarah. You're projecting." "Am I?" She turned to him, eyes blazing. "Coyotes have distinct vocalizations, barks for warning, yips for gathering, howls for territory. But do you know what they do when they mourn?" Will hesitated. He'd heard stories of mates calling for days after a partner was killed, a sound that was less a howl and more a keen. "They wait," Sarah said. "They visit the site. They remember. And that male out there, he remembers his family." She moved toward the door. Will stepped in front of her, blocking the way. "I can't let you do this," he said. "If you walk out there, I can't guarantee I can protect you." "I don't want you to protect me," Sarah said, reaching for the doorknob. "I need to finish this alone." Will looked at her, really looked at her. The fear was gone, replaced by a grim determination. She looked like someone walking to the gallows, but with her head held high. He stepped aside. Sarah opened the door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of sagebrush and ozone. She stepped onto the porch, leaving the safety of the house behind. Will grabbed his rifle just in case and followed her out, stopping at the railing. Sarah walked down the steps and onto the gravel. She didn't stop at the edge of the driveway this time. She kept walking, out onto the frost-covered grass, toward the line of coyotes on the ridge. The pack stood up as one, ears pricked forward, tails held low. Sarah stopped about 20 yards from them. She didn't kneel this time. She stood tall, facing the notched ear male. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. "I'm here," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the silence of the morning, it carried perfectly. The notched ear male took a step forward, then another. He moved with a fluid grace, his paws making no sound. He stopped 10 feet from her. Up close, he was magnificent, a survivor of winters and droughts and men with guns. His coat was thick, his eyes intelligent and unyielding. Sarah slowly lowered herself to her knees again, not in submission but in respect. Eye level. "I see you," she whispered. "I know who you are." The coyote tilted his head. He let out a soft whine, a sound so unexpected it made Will's breath catch. It wasn't aggression, it was recognition. For a long moment, woman and beast stared at each other across the divide of species and history. Then, the coyote did something extraordinary. He sat down. He threw his head back and let out a single, long, mournful howl. It wasn't the chaotic yipping of a hunt. It was a pure, lonely note that rose into the cold air and hung there, vibrating with loss. One by one, the other coyotes joined in, a chorus of sorrow. They weren't celebrating a kill. They were singing a eulogy. Sarah bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. She let the sound wash over her, a wave of grief that matched her own. She understood now. They hadn't trapped her to hurt her. They had trapped her to make her listen, to make her bear witness to the song of the family she had helped destroy. The howling went on for a full minute, echoing off the distant hills. Then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. Silence rushed back in, louder than before. The notched ear male stood up. He looked at Sarah one last time, a long, penetrating gaze that seemed to say, "Now you know." He turned. Without a backward glance, he trotted away over the ridge. The others followed, slipping into the brush like ghosts, until the field was empty. Sarah stayed on her knees, sobbing quietly into the frost. Will walked out to her then. He didn't say a word. He just placed a hand on her shoulder and stood guard while she cried, watching the empty horizon where the coyotes had vanished. He realized then that saving her hadn't been about fighting off a pack of predators. It had been about witnessing an apology, or maybe a penance. The silence that followed Sarah's departure from the farm was heavier than the dawn mist. She didn't just leave Will Carter's land, she left with a mission that would shake the dust off the entire county. Sarah drove straight to the State Wildlife Agency, bypassing the local deputies entirely. She walked in with her old field journals, the ones she had kept hidden in a shoebox for 5 years. They were filled with dates, coordinates, and the names of the men who had paid for the extermination. She laid them out on a metal table, her hands steady for the first time in days. "I'm not asking for immunity," she told the investigator, a stern man with graying temples. "I'm asking you to stop it." The investigation that followed was swift and brutal, tearing through the quiet secrecy of the rural community like a wildfire. Sarah revealed the mechanics of the clandestine program. She explained how they hadn't just shot coyotes. They had used poisons banned decades ago, substances that didn't just kill the target, but seeped into the water table and killed eagles, badgers, and family dogs. She explained the ecological cost, the trophic cascade. "When you wipe out the apex predator in this scrubland," she testified during a heated town hall meeting, her voice projecting over the grumbles of angry ranchers, "you don't get safer livestock. You get an explosion of rodents. You get sick deer populations. You get chaos. And because we shattered their pack structures, we created rogue males, transients who were desperate and unpredictable. We didn't fix the problem. We created it." The fallout was immediate. 3 large ranches were placed under federal interdiction. A dozen fines were levied, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars. 2 prominent local financiers, Men who sat in the front pew at church every Sunday, were indicted for violating federal wildlife protection acts. The community fractured. In the local diner, the air grew thick whenever Will Carter walked in. To half the town, he was the man who had sheltered a whistleblower, a traitor to the agricultural code of silence. They muttered into their coffee cups, turning their backs when he passed. But to the others, the younger farmers trying to work with the land rather than conquer it, the families who had lost pets to the illegal poisons, Will was something else. He was the one who had stood between a terrified woman and the wild, refusing to let violence be the answer. Will didn't care about the whispers. He cared about the quiet. For weeks, the farm was peaceful. The unnatural tension that had gripped the animals lifted. The horses grazed near the fence line again. The chickens roamed the yard without freezing at every shadow. It was as if the land itself was exhaling. But Will kept watching the ridge. He knew that coyotes had excellent memories. Studies showed they could recognize individual human faces and retain that information for years. If you were a threat, they vanished. If you were neutral, they ignored you. But if you were part of a significant event, they didn't just forget. 7 days after the indictments were announced, on a morning that smelled of coming snow, Will went out to check the fence line. The sun was just crowning the eastern hills, painting the frost in shades of violet and gold. Will stopped at the exact spot where the circle had been formed. The grass there was still matted down, a physical memory of the vigil. He felt eyes on him. He turned slowly toward the tree line. They were there. Not the whole pack this time, just 3 of them. And in the center, sitting on his haunches with the regal bearing of an old king, was the male with the notched ear. Will's hand drifted toward his belt, a reflex, but he stopped himself. There was no aggression in the animal's posture. The coyote wasn't crouching. His hackles weren't raised. He was simply sitting, the morning breeze ruffling his thick winter coat. Coyotes are often called the tricksters of Navajo legends, the shapeshifters who bring chaos. But looking at the animal now, Will didn't see a trickster. He saw a survivor. He saw a creature that had lost its family to human cruelty, had tracked the source of that pain, and had extracted a confession without spilling a drop of blood. The notched ear male looked Will dead in the eye. It was a look of profound intelligence. In the wild, staring is usually a challenge, but this felt different. It felt like an acknowledgement. "We saw what you did. We saw that she paid. The debt was settled." Will nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. The coyote held the gaze for a heartbeat longer. Then he stood up. He didn't slink away. He turned with deliberation, his tail sweeping the air, and trotted toward the dense brush. The other 2 followed, their movements synchronized and silent. They didn't look back. Will stood there until the sun was fully up, warming the back of his neck. He understood then that that terrifying morning hadn't been about survival. It hadn't been an attack. It was a transaction. The coyotes had demanded the truth, the one thing Sarah had been too afraid to speak. They had cornered her until she found the courage to offer it up. And now that the truth was out, now that the poison was gone and the land was safe, they returned to being ghosts in the sagebrush. Sarah had paid with her reputation. She had paid with the truth. And in exchange, the wild had granted her and Will peace. Will picked up his bucket and turned back toward the farmhouse. The wind picked up, singing through the wire fence, but for the first time in a long time, it sounded like a song, not a warning.